we look at the English Reformation as it happened in England in course of the 16th century. Reformation came to England under Henry VIII, the Tudor monarch, through acts of parliament in the 1530s, which mounted an attack on the church through which at least a jurisdictional reformation was established in England. While in Europe, Reformation was initiated by reformers and theologians and attacked the theological basis of the religion and rituals. The reason why Henry engaged with the church was that he desired a divorce with his wife Catherine. The divorce question came to be known as the king's great matter. In spite of the best efforts of Cardinal Wolsey, his minister, the Roman Church refused to grant the divorce. Henry started by summoning the Parliament in 1529 to redress the enormities of the clergy. His basic aim was threefold: to rally the country through Parliament, to attack certain prerogatives or privileges of the Church, and to frighten the Pope into submission as far as the divorce was concerned. The Parliament, however, had nothing to do with the divorce. The Parliament met from 1529 and continued till 1536. This is known as the Reformation Parliament, and this Reformation Parliament effected the official Henrician Reformation. The initial period from 1529 to 32 saw Parliament passing enactments which sought to control the church, take away the freedom of the convocations and bring them under the control of the king. But it is only after 1533, when Thomas Cromwell entered the council and became ultimately the king's secretary and minister, that real attack was mounted on the position of the Pope in the church. We shall come to that later. G.R. Elton has called it an act of state only because the initiative in England was taken not by religious reformers but by the state, the king and his officers and Parliament. Yet the impact of the Reformation on the history of England was very profound. It was an attempt to establish the power of the Tudor state in no uncertain matter over the Pope, who controlled the English Church from Rome, as England was also part of the Universal Church of Rome. A.J. Dickens, however, has questioned the designation of this as a purely political act, because the question can easily be raised. If the king was trying to overhaul the jurisdictional control of the church, why would the people allow him to do so? Dickens would say that there was a tradition of dissent in the religious history of England. It started with John Wycliffe and his band of followers who came to be known as the Lollards. Wycliffe said that the ritual accretions over the centuries had deprived the Bible of its essence. Therefore, it is necessary to go to the Bible by each devotee. There was group reading of the Bible, and it was during this time that the Bible was translated into English as well. Now, this English Bible had a lot of impact, or at least some impact in certain areas. Dickens would argue that this provided sustenance to the beginning or remounting of even religious dissent. In England, people like Colet and Erasmus, just as they had Erasmus's impact was on the Continental Reformation. Here, these people raised questions that stoked the doubts even among the common men. But in England, it is curious that Sir Thomas More, a renowned humanist, was with the church. He was not with the dissenters. There was considerable Lutheran influence within the court as well. In Cambridge, there was a group of savants who were very, very sympathetic to the Reformed beliefs and were seriously questioning the existing religion, though very quietly. The tavern that they used to frequent came to be known as Little Germany. So the influence of the German Reformation was, it appears, important or significant on these people. Among them we have William Tyndale, Robert Burns, Thomas Cranmer, who would become the Archbishop later. Even Thomas Cromwell, King's Secretary, was also probably influenced by this because of his wide travels in Europe before he returned to England to settle down. Tyndale, for example, translated the Bible into English, and this was becoming very popular. It has been argued by Dickens and Parker and many others that it is because of this existence of religious dissent that it was easier for the king to mount an attack. But does it mean there was a groundswell of dissent or discontent, religious discontent in England? Many other historians have not found evidence of this. Scarisbrick indeed said that the idea that Henry and the Parliament rode the tiger of a groundswell of dissent is suspect because there is no evidence of a tiger. There was not so much of a defense. But Dickens and others would like to argue that there was a tradition of unorthodoxy that ultimately favored the movement towards Protestantism. We have to explain that after Henry VIII's death, after all, Protestantism did come to England, and finally it was firmly established as the religion of England by Elizabeth between 1558 and 1563. We shall turn to that later. Let us look at the essence of this Reformation by looking at the major acts of Parliament. Between 1532 and 1536, the Crown's legal authority over the Church was gradually established through parliamentary legislation. First, the convocations surrendered their right to enact new canons without the king's permission. Secondly, the Act of Appeals stopped all appeals to be sent to Rome. England being an imperium, the king is the emperor, and everything would be decided within the territorial jurisdiction of England. And as a result of this, Thomas Cranmer was able to grant the divorce later. Taxation, the revenue that went to the church was gradually transferred to the king and the king's government through a series of acts of annates. There were several. The king reserved the right to nominate bishops in England. These were traditionally the prerogative of the Pope himself. The papal power of dispensing canon laws was transferred to the Archbishop of Canterbury as the head of the National Church of England. And finally, the Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared that the king was the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Everyone was also required to take an oath acknowledging the royal supremacy. So here we see that basically what the Parliament sought to do was to substitute the Pope's control or authority over the Church in England by the royal authority over the Church in England. But what happened to religion? Were religious changes also attempted during this period? Yes. And here we see the subtle attempt by the reforming officials or to those who favored reform to have their way. First, The 10 articles, it elaborated religion, and it said that all the sacraments were not necessary. Some of the sacraments were necessary, others were merely convenient. It had an orthodox position on the baptism, altar, and penance. These are necessary sacraments. Secondly, an order on the dissolution of monasteries after 1536 was a very serious attack, not just on papal influence or papal authority, but on the religion itself. The monasteries had been very important centers for alms. The monasteries were dissolved, started with the minor monasteries, going on to the big monasteries. Entire wealth of these monasteries was taken over by the government. It also made the king rich for a while at least. Cromwell introduced the great Bible, Matthew's Bible, which was garbed in a Protestant dress by Tyndale. Now this, and coupled with the fact that English was used to be used compulsorily as the language of church services, meant that gradually Protestant ideas were very subtly disseminated to the laity through these church services. This was a very important innovation. But in 1539, after Cromwell was there no more, after he had been executed, the Act of 6 Articles was passed thanks to the authority of Duke of Norfolk. This brought back England to a very rigid Catholic position. It said denial of 6 traditional beliefs would be considered to be wrong and cognizable offense. Bishop's book and the King's book had come. King's book had also been very, very conservative as far as religious doctrine was concerned. But at the same time, in 1543, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop, introduced an English liturgy which was rather Protestant, or which contained a lot of Protestant ideas. And Cranmer later said that he was astonished at the king's support for the advanced cause of reform, because the king accepted this. Let us look at the nature or the character of this Reformation. Henrician Reformation was the supremacy of the secular government over the church. The changes were accepted by the clergy, but possibly without any conviction or any enthusiasm. The establishment of royal supremacy over the Church of England in reality transformed the church in England into the Church of England. This was, as Elton has said, a jurisdictional revolution in the church, not a religious revolution. Yet it gave English church a new unity, a new organization, a new authority under God, though not yet a new doctrine. Thus, the Henrician Reformation represented a schism, but it was not a doctrinal reformation, it was a jurisdictional one. Second, the conflict was between the Papal Church of Rome and the national state of England. This is why Elton has called it an act of state. The religion in England, we must remember, remained Roman Catholicism, but it was minus the Pope. So there was at least acceptance of what was happening without any loud protest. One feature was gradualism. There were attempts at coercion as well. The Treason Act, for example, one who did not take the oath had perished. And indeed, for dissent, even Sir Thomas More had perished. There were certain resistances, like the Pilgrimage of Grace, which was believed to have been a kind of a peasant revolt against the dissolution of monasteries. It was possible for the government to control them and to suppress them with relative ease. Thirdly, as many historians like Dickens, Parker, or Christopher Haig had said, even though it was an act of state, it was carried through by the agencies of state and for reasons of state. There had been religious fallout of the entire process. For one, it pushed England out of the continental Reformation or the continental movement and allowed England ultimately to have its own unique Reformation. The point is that reformist ideas did make a certain quiet advance in England. There were, we have noticed, existence of reformers or those who inclined towards reform in the council. Thomas Cranmer, for example, there were men like Robert Burns and Tyndale and Coverdale. Thomas Cromwell, who was the real man behind the parliamentary action between 1532 and 1538-39, was also probably a little soft towards the reformed ideas. A second very important point in this is the introduction of English as compulsorily the language of church service, and the introduction of the English Bible was given a Protestant dress by Tyndale. The new Queen Catherine Parr had very definite sympathies for certain reformed ideas at least. Another important point to note is that the king appointed Protestant tutors for his young son, who would be the next king as Edward VI. Now the point is, as Elton has made, that if England continued to be a Roman Catholic country by religion, sooner or later there had to be a reconciliation with the Pope. And this will compromise the royal supremacy in England, which he and Cromwell had so painstakingly established. This is why if royal supremacy, if the political point of the Reformation had to be preserved, there had to be a change in religion as well. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain why there was a Protestant Reformation in the next reign, so soon after the removal of Henry VIII. There had been certain religious changes as well. They were often imperceptible, slow, and gradual. But unless there had been certain religious changes as well, it would be difficult to explain why England became a Protestant country in Edward's time, and after the Marian Counter-Reformation, England, the Anglican Church was firmly established by Elizabeth. Now we look at the Edwardian Reformation. Religious reformation was a serious problem that the new reign had to tackle. There was a need for uniformity. If the break from Rome was to be implemented, in 1549, Thomas Cranmer introduced the first Book of Common Prayer. This contained doctrines. Cranmer's language was so couched that the Catholics could believe that there was a lot for them in this prayer book, that it was not a solidly Protestant prayer book, though apart from the Eucharist, it generally adopted a Protestant stance so far as the sacraments and a lot of other doctrines were concerned. This was followed by an act of uniformity, that England will have one and only one form of religion. The church services were compulsory, and this was to be according to the first Book of Common Prayer. In 1552, Cranmer produced the second Book of Common Prayer, which was a more orthodox document as far as Protestant belief was concerned. Now there was no chance for the Catholics to interpret that there was something in them. Indeed, the sacrament of the body and the sacrament of the blood was substituted by simply the bread and the cup. This time the Catholics did not have the chance of interpreting real presence. The new prayer book was also enforced by the Act of Uniformity, and finally came the 42 Articles. These 42 Articles elaborately defined the doctrinal basis of the new Church of England. And this was Protestantism. It is true that the Edwardian Reformation was superficial. It was probably imposed on a reluctant clergy who accepted it, but one who did not accept was Mary, Edward's elder sister. Edward died young. In 1553, Mary became the queen and reigned till 1558. Mary's single aim was to restore the English church to the Pope and to Roman Catholicism. Mary's brief reign has been described as the period of counter-reformation in England. Papal supremacy was restored, royal supremacy was dead, or would have continued to be dead had Mary had her way. She died in 1558, but within this, she restored Roman Catholicism as far as she could, because Protestantism as yet did not acquire very deep roots, and people did not really appreciate that there was a change, apart from the fact that there was very serious persecution. There was persecution under Edward VI as well of the Catholics. But now the Marian persecutions led to the emergence of a new category of people known as the Marian exiles. And they were gone to the continent, and there they acquired even farther, even stronger religious belief inclined towards Protestantism. There were many, many martyrs, people like Hooker, Ridley, Cranmer, and Bishop Latimer. They all perished on the flames. John Fox, in his book Acts and Monuments, have celebrated the lives of all these martyrs. Now, after Mary's death, Elizabeth became the queen. And the future of the English church remained uncertain. Elizabeth had some problems. The Roman church did not accept Elizabeth's birth as legitimate because they never sanctioned the marriage of Henry VIII with Anne Boleyn. So, compromise with the Catholics might get Elizabeth the legitimacy she required or she needed. Mary had restored Catholicism. Continuing with Catholicism might give her some leeway and provide for continuity. There were in England at that time several groups. Elizabeth herself felt that extremism was becoming the spirit of the day among both the Protestants and the Catholics. The major parties were the moderate Protestants, who would have been glad to continue with the Edwardian Reformation, the Puritans, who clamored for a more radical Reformation, and the Catholics, who would have wanted to continue with the Marian counter-reformation. We cannot go into the details, but we note that ultimately she decided to throw in her lot with the Protestants. She had her Protestant members in Parliament to pacify as well, and to come to some kind of an agreement. Let us briefly look at the Elizabethan settlement, and then we'll look at its nature. It relied on two basic documents, the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. The Act of Supremacy reasserted the authority of the secular government over the Church of England by once again denying the authority of the Roman Pope over this church. The monarch was the supreme governor of the Church of England in all things ecclesiastical as well as temporal. She delegated some of her powers to a High Commission. The Parliament was empowered to enforce an oath of supremacy on all the subjects. The Edwardian prayer book, the second prayer book, was reasserted and reintroduced as containing the doctrines. And finally, in 1563 came the Act of 39 Articles, which defined the doctrine of this new church. So between 1558 and 1563, the Elizabethan Church took shape, and from 1563 to 1603, when she died, Elizabeth spent her time tackling the opposition to what came to be known as the Anglican Church and allowing it to acquire roots. There was also serious enforcement. There was a court of the High Commission, which looked after the legislative aspect of the enforcement aspects. There was what came to be known as the shilling fine, a fine of 1 shilling if one did not attend the church services on Sundays and other holy days. This was meant to enforce that there was one and only one form of service. The Catholics did not have the right to perform services. Catholics, the Puritans, continued, but they had to do it in greatest secrecy. First, let us look at the supremacy of Henry and the supremacy of Elizabeth. The two were different. On matters of dogma and belief, Elizabeth did not wish to exercise any control. Second characteristic is that the Parliament was not an agent, but was becoming a coordinate power in this enforcement, in this bringing about an enforcement of the Reformation. It's the Parliamentary Act that endorsed, that sanctioned the taking of punitive measures against those who did not take the oath or who did not come into the services regularly. So the point that is to be made is that the Elizabethan settlement was also a statutory settlement. In England, the church ornaments were taken down, the images were taken down by hired masons, as one historian had said, unlike on the continent when angry mobs destroyed the churches. Now, there is a difference of opinion in this. Dickens believes that it was not a compromise, it was rather a middle way between the personal belief of the Queen and those entertained by Richard Cox and other moderate members of Parliament who were Protestant in their belief. At any rate, whether it was a compromise or not, what it did was to give England a Protestant form of religion at once. There was no dilly-dallying. Elizabeth did not take a lot of time. Within the 5 years, she had established the contours of the national church in England and gave it a firm doctrine. Because of the presence of the Puritans in the Parliament, there was pressure on her to move further, but she did not. Even the Roman Catholics initially thought that the settlement could be acceptable to them. When they realized that it was a firmly Protestant settlement, it was late and the settlement had acquired firm roots by then. Yet, Catholicism survived in England. As A.L. Rose had said, Catholicism survived in England provided it was discreet and did not flaunt itself. And he also said that it gave England stability, it gave England a Protestant religion, but also probably the greatest amount of liberty of opinion compared to the other areas of Europe. This is not to say that there was no persecution, but persecution was far less compared to the continent. But Elizabeth did have to protect her settlement from the Catholic recusants. There were many Catholics who did not accept this oath and remained active, religiously speaking. And when after 1570 the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth, the Catholics were free and the danger they posed became stronger. On the other hand, there were the Puritans. Elizabeth temporized. She was temperamentally not an extremist, did not favor extremism. And therefore, she tried to follow a middle way. But the Puritans were given a leeway. They were still very active, and finally, she had to move against them as well. In the process, right through her reign, Anglicanism, which became the new established Church of England, acquired deep roots and continued to be the Church of England. So the Reformation in England had a different trajectory, had different characteristics, and so far as spirit and enforcement and the stages of the Reformation were concerned, it had entirely different characteristics from that on the continent.